I can't stay silent anymore. That's the sentence people keep coming back to. The line pulled from an interview that finally pushed Betty Whittaker's name back into the headlines, this time through New York Post. After years of other people telling her story, interpreting her life, and speaking over her, Betty spoke in her own voice. Or at least as close to her own voice as a national tabloid would allow. For a long time, silence was the only thing left to her. The world first learned about the Whittaker family through outsiders. Filmmakers, journalists, internet commentators, YouTubers, people who arrived, filmed, asked questions, and left. Each time, pieces of the family's life were extracted and rearranged for public consumption. Shock, curiosity, sympathy, judgment, then silence again. But this time was different. This time, Betty opened the door herself. When a New York Post interview appeared, it didn't introduce a new tragedy. It confirmed one that had been unfolding quietly for months. Betty had not seen Ray, Lorraine, or Timmy since Adult Protective Services removed them from the home. She did not know exactly where they were. She did not know when she would see them again. And according to her own words, she did not understand why the family had been separated in the first place. That confusion sits at the center of everything. In the interview, Betty does not accuse. She does not offer a detailed timeline. She does not lay out a legal argument. She simply repeats the same truth she has been repeating to every stranger who knocks on her door. I don't know. Those 3 words have become the most haunting part of the Whittaker story. When asked why her family was taken, she says she doesn't know. When asked where they're now, she says she doesn't know. When asked if she's been allowed to see them, she says no. To the outside world, that sounds impossible. To anyone familiar with disability, poverty, and state systems, it sounds painfully familiar. Betty Whittaker is elderly. She is intellectually disabled. She has lived most of her life in isolation. She has never had consistent advocacy. She does not navigate bureaucracies easily. She does not understand legal language. And now, she is expected to understand why the most important people in her life were removed without her having any clear explanation she can repeat. In the interview, she doesn't present herself as a victim of a conspiracy. She doesn't claim mistreatment in dramatic terms. She simply sounds lost. And that may be the most honest part of the story. The New York Post framed the interview as a shocking revelation. But nothing Betty said was new to people who had been paying attention. What made it powerful was not the information, but the platform. Once a story appears in a major outlet, it stops being local gossip or internet speculation. It becomes part of the public record. It becomes something the state, the media, and the audience can no longer pretend not to see. The article describes the Whittaker home in harsh terms. Ramshackle, dirty, unsanitary. Images are included. Old photos, possibly newer ones. The implication is clear. This environment was unfit. But what the article does not fully address is the most uncomfortable question of all. If the state knew about these conditions for decades, why now? That question is never answered directly. Instead, the blame is diffused. Social media attention, viral videos, online outrage, increased scrutiny, pressure, exposure. The suggestion is that once the family became a global spectacle, intervention became unavoidable. But from Betty's point of view, that explanation doesn't bring clarity. It only deepens the confusion. She lived in that house for decades. Her siblings lived there for decades. Timmy lived there his entire life. If something was so dangerous that it required immediate removal, why were no criminal charges filed? Why was no clear explanation given her? Why was she not assigned a visible advocate to walk her through what was happening? These are not accusations. They're questions, and they remain unanswered. The interview also reveals something else the public rarely considers. Betty's isolation didn't end when her family was taken. It intensified. Now, instead of being surrounded by familiar faces, she is alone in a house the world has already judged. And because the Whittaker story has gone global, that house is no longer private. Reporters knock. Strangers drive by. Cameras appear. Each person asks the same questions, hoping for a soundbite, a quote, a moment of clarity. And each time, Betty opens the door. Not because she wants attention, not because she understands the consequences, but because she doesn't know how to say no. The New York Post interview captures this reality without fully acknowledging it. Betty answers questions the way she always has, politely, simply, without realizing that every word will be analyzed, replayed, and debated by millions of strangers. When she says she hasn't seen her family, people argue about policy. When she says she doesn't know why they were taken, people argue about neglect. When she says she wants to see them again, people argue about safety. But very few people ask what Betty herself needs in order to survive this moment. She is not a legal expert. She is not a spokesperson. She is not equipped to defend herself against national scrutiny. Yet she has become the face of a family tragedy she cannot fully explain. The interview also exposes another painful reality. Betty has no buffer between herself and the world. No media representative. No attorney speaking on her behalf. No advocate controlling access. No one screening questions or deciding which stories get told and which do not. So when the New York Post wanted a story, they didn't go through a gatekeeper. They went straight to the door. And Betty answered. From the outside, the article reads like an expose. From the inside, it reads like a cry for help that Betty herself may not even realize she is making. She does not say, I was wronged. She does not say they lied. She does not say, I demand justice. She says, I don't know. That uncertainty is not proof of guilt or innocence. It is proof of vulnerability. And it raises a troubling question that the interview never fully confronts. If Betty cannot understand what is happening to her family, how can she meaningfully participate in the process that decides their future? This is where the tragedy deepens. Because once her story appeared in the New York Post, the audience changed. This was no longer just YouTube viewers or online forums. This was mainstream attention, national attention, international attention. And with that attention came more opinions, more assumptions, and more people claiming to know what is best for the Whittakers. But knowing about someone's life is not the same as protecting it. The interview ends without resolution. No timeline for visits. No explanation from the state. No clear path forward. Just images, quotes, and a woman standing in a doorway answering questions she cannot answer. And that is where part one leaves us. With a woman who says she can't stay silent anymore, even though silence may be the only language she was ever taught. Comment below what you think. Once the interview appeared, the tone of the conversation around the Whittakers changed almost overnight. What had once lived mostly in comment sections and niche online spaces now moved into mainstream discourse. The moment Betty's words were printed by the New York Post, the story stopped being speculative. It became official. It became something people felt licensed to dissect. And with that shift came a new wave of attention that Betty was not prepared for. People began sharing the article across platforms, often without context, often without restraint. Headlines were reposted. Screenshots were cropped. Quotes were isolated. Betty's face appeared next to phrases like family tragedy and state intervention, as if those words alone could explain decades of complexity. But the article itself offered no real answers. It didn't explain what legal threshold had been crossed. It didn't describe a clear timeline of warnings or interventions. It didn't include statements from caseworkers who had directly interacted with Betty. Instead, it leaned heavily on imagery and implication. allowing readers to fill in the blanks with their own assumptions. And people did exactly that. Some read the interview and concluded that the state had acted too late. Others concluded it had acted too harshly. Some believed the family had been failed for years. Others believed the removal proved long-standing neglect. But nearly everyone agreed on one thing. Betty did not seem to understand what was happening to her. That realization unsettled people far more than the condition of the house ever could. In the interview, Betty doesn't argue against the state. She doesn't defend the home. She doesn't explain daily routines or caregiving arrangements. She doesn't even challenge the descriptions used by the paper. She simply answers questions in the most basic way she knows how. And in doing so, she exposes the central problem no headline can capture. She is being asked to represent a story she does not control. Once the article circulated, reporters from other outlets reportedly reached out. Online creators responded with videos. Commentators offered interpretations. And once again, Betty became the focal point of a conversation she could not guide. People debated whether it was ethical for a national tabloid to interview an elderly, intellectually disabled woman without a visible advocate present. Others argued that the public had a right to hear her side. But what often went unexamined was whether Betty herself understood what it meant to give her side in the first place. Consent is not just saying yes to a question. Consent requires understanding the consequences of answering it. The article does not clarify whether Betty was informed how widely her words would be shared. It does not explain whether she understood the permanence of a national publication. It does not mention whether anyone explained how her quotes could influence public opinion, state decisions, or future scrutiny. What it shows instead is a woman standing in the doorway of her home, answering questions because someone asked them. This is where the story becomes less about the Whittakers and more about how society treats vulnerable people once their lives become public property. The interview sparked renewed discussion about the role of social media in the family situation. The article suggests that viral attention accelerated state intervention. That idea resonated with many readers who had watched the family story unfold online over the years. It reinforced the belief that exposure, not just conditions, triggered action, but exposure is a double-edged sword. While it can bring resources and attention, it also invites judgment, misunderstanding, and intrusion. Once a story goes viral, nuance is often the first casualty. And in Betty's case, nuance was never offered enough space to begin with. After the article's release, people began showing up again. Not just reporters, but strangers. Some curious, some sympathetic, some angry, some convinced they knew the truth better than the people living it. Betty's house, already a symbol, became an open set, and Betty kept answering the door. That pattern, answering questions without understanding the implications, is what troubles advocates the most, because every interaction shapes how the state perceives her capacity, how the public judges her credibility, and how future decisions might be made about her family. Yet no one appears to be standing between her and that risk. The interview also reignited debate about why no visits had occurred. Betty says she has not seen her siblings or Timmy since they were taken. She does not describe violent incidents, criminal behavior, or immediate danger. She simply says they were told they could not live there anymore. For many readers, that raised red flags. If the situation was so dire, why were no criminal charges filed? If the environment was unsafe, why was there no documented plan shared with her? If removal was necessary, why was reunification or visitation not clearly explained? These questions don't accuse. They highlight gaps. And those gaps matter because they shape how a vulnerable person understands what is happening to them. Without explanations she can process, Betty is left in a state of emotional suspension. She doesn't know whether she did something wrong. She doesn't know whether she is being punished. She doesn't know whether she will ever see her family again. Living in that uncertainty is its own kind of harm. The article also includes descriptions of the home's condition that reignited criticism. Bugs, food, disorganization. But for many people familiar with poverty and disability, those details raised another question. Where was the long-term support? The state had known about the Whittakers for years. Volunteers had reportedly cleaned the home before. Donations had poured in. Attention had come and gone. Yet the article suggests that conditions remain poor. If that is true, it does not point only to individual failure. It points to systemic neglect. You cannot spotlight a family for decades and then act shocked when poverty persists. You cannot expose them to the world without ensuring ongoing support. And you cannot remove family members without ensuring the remaining ones are protected from further harm. The New York Post interview did not answer those questions, but it forced them into the open, and it changed how people saw Betty. Before, she was often spoken about. Now, she was speaking, even if she didn't fully understand how. That shift carries weight. Because once a vulnerable person's words become part of the public narrative, they can be used in ways the speaker never intended. Sympathy can turn into scrutiny. Curiosity can turn into judgment. And concern can turn into control. Betty did not say she wanted attention. She did not say she wanted publicity. She said she wanted her family. And that distinction matters. The tragedy of the interview is not that it revealed something shocking. It's that it revealed how unprepared the world is to hear from someone like Betty without harming her in the process. Because telling your story should not require you to become a spectacle. And speaking should not come at the cost of safety. As the dust from the interview settled, one truth became impossible to ignore. Betty Whittaker needs an advocate, not a savior, not a spokesperson, not a stranger with promises. A trained, professional advocate who understands her needs, her rights, and her limitations. Without that, every interview becomes a risk. Every knock at the door becomes a threat. Every headline becomes another layer of confusion. And the more attention the story receives, the more dangerous that absence becomes. This is where part 2 ends, not with answers, but with a growing sense of urgency. Because once a vulnerable person's silence is broken, the responsibility to protect them does not disappear. It grows. Comment below what you think. After the interview circulated, something subtle but dangerous began to happen. Betty Whittaker was no longer just a woman living alone in a house at the edge of a hollow. She became a symbol. And once someone becomes a symbol, people stop listening to what they actually say and start hearing what they want to hear. The article published by the New York Post gave the impression that Betty was finally telling her truth. But truth, in this case, is complicated, because telling the truth requires understanding it. And understanding it requires access to information, support, and guidance that Betty does not appear to have. What Betty offered in that interview wasn't a narrative. It wasn't an explanation. It wasn't a defense. It was a series of honest responses rooted in confusion. She didn't reconstruct events. She didn't clarify timelines. She didn't accuse the state or absolve herself. She simply responded to questions as they were presented to her. And yet, the public interpreted those responses as if they were a complete account. This is where media responsibility becomes impossible to ignore. When journalists interview people with intellectual disabilities, the responsibility does not end with asking questions politely. It extends to ensuring comprehension. It requires verifying that the person understands what they are agreeing to, how their words will be used, and what the potential consequences might be. It also requires evaluating whether the interview itself could cause harm. In Betty's case, the interview may have done all 3 things at once: exposed her confusion, amplified her vulnerability, and placed her under a spotlight she cannot manage. The most troubling part is that none of this appears intentional. There is no evidence that the reporter acted maliciously. But harm does not require intent. Sometimes harm happens simply because no one stopped to ask whether the person at the center of the story had the capacity to carry it. After the article ran, online discussions intensified. Some people questioned whether Betty was being truthful. Others questioned whether she was being manipulative. Some accused her of hiding something. Others accused the state of cruelty. And still others blamed social media, filmmakers, YouTubers, neighbors, or even Betty herself. Very few paused to ask the simplest question of all: what does Betty actually understand? The answer matters because understanding shapes responsibility, and responsibility shapes judgment. Betty has spent her entire life in an environment where decisions were made around her, not with her. She grew up without formal education. She lived in isolation. She depended on family for structure and routine. She never developed the tools needed to navigate institutions, legal systems, or public scrutiny. When the state stepped in, she was not prepared. When reporters arrived, she was not prepared. When the internet reacted, she was not prepared. Yet she's being evaluated as if she were. This is one of the most dangerous aspects of media exposure involving vulnerable people. The audience often assumes that because someone speaks, they must fully understand what they are saying. That assumption collapses when disability enters the picture. Betty's repeated statement, "I don't know," is not evasive. It is not strategic. It is not dishonest. It is the most accurate reflection of her internal reality. She does not know why her family was taken. She does not know where they are. She does not know when she will see them again. And that lack of knowledge is not a failure on her part. It is a failure of the system that removed her family without ensuring she understood what was happening. The interview also exposed another uncomfortable truth. Betty does not have control over who enters her life. Reporters knock. Strangers approach. Cameras appear. And she answers, not because she wants attention, but because she lacks the capacity to enforce boundaries. This lack of boundaries has already caused significant harm. People have shown up unannounced. Strangers have called her. Outsiders have made promises they cannot keep. And now, major media outlets have joined the list of people entering her world without a clear plan to protect her afterward. Once the interview was published, it became evidence in the court of public opinion. People dissected her words, her tone, her body language. They analyzed photos of her home. They speculated about what she wasn't saying. And in doing so, they assigned meaning to silence that may not exist. This is especially dangerous because Betty cannot correct the record. She cannot issue statements. She cannot clarify misinterpretations. She cannot defend herself against narratives she does not understand. Once her words are published, they belong to everyone else. And that ownership comes with consequences. The article also fueled renewed interest from outsiders who believe they can help. Some reached out offering support. Others offered advice. Some promised solutions. And once again, Betty became a magnet for people who see vulnerability as an invitation. This pattern, exposure followed by intrusion, has defined the Whittaker story for years. Each wave of attention brings new voices, new assumptions, and new risks. And each time, the family situation becomes more unstable. The irony is painful. The very act of giving Betty a voice may have increased the danger around her. This raises an ethical question that cannot be ignored. Is it responsible to amplify the voice of a vulnerable person if doing so places them at greater risk? There's no easy answer. But what is clear is that voice without protection is not empowerment. It is exposure. True empowerment would mean ensuring Betty has an advocate before she speaks. Someone who can explain the process to her. someone who can help her understand her rights, someone who can control access to her time, her space, and her story. Without that, every interview becomes another extraction. The media often frames stories like this as necessary awareness. But awareness without accountability changes nothing. It does not guarantee support. It does not ensure safety. It does not restore family connections. It simply moves the story forward for the audience while leaving the subject behind. Betty's interview revealed pain, confusion, and longing. It did not reveal strategy. It did not reveal manipulation. It did not reveal guilt or innocence. It revealed vulnerability. And vulnerability should trigger protection, not consumption. As public interest grows, so does the risk that Betty will be further misunderstood. Already, some people have begun using her words as justification for their own conclusions. Others have dismissed her entirely, arguing that her lack of clarity undermines her credibility. Both responses miss the point. Betty's credibility is not the issue. Her safety is. She does not need more interviews. She does not need more headlines. She does not need more strangers knocking on her door. She needs someone who understands how to stand between her and the world. Until that happens, every new article, every new post, every new video adds another layer of pressure to a life already overwhelmed by loss. Part 3 ends with a realization that is difficult to accept. Sometimes silence protects, and sometimes breaking silence without support causes harm. Betty said she couldn't stay silent anymore. The world listened, but listening is not enough. The real question now is whether anyone will step in to protect her from the consequences of being heard. Comment below what you think. By the time the interview had circulated through the internet, the damage was already done. Betty Whittaker's words were no longer hers alone. They had been lifted, reshaped, debated, and weaponized by people who would never sit across from her at a kitchen table or look her in the eye when she said she didn't know what was happening to her family. What began as a moment of honesty became a catalyst. The article published by the New York Post did not create the Whittaker tragedy, but it magnified it. It turned a private crisis into a public reckoning and forced everyone involved, the state, the media, and the audience, into an uncomfortable position. Once a vulnerable person speaks publicly, the responsibility shifts outward. The question is no longer whether they were heard. It becomes whether they were protected. And in Betty's case, protection is what remains missing. At no point in the interview does it appear that Betty was given an advocate to help her navigate the aftermath. There is no indication that she was briefed on what the publication of her words would mean. There is no evidence that safeguards were put in place to manage the increased attention she would receive. The interview ends, but Betty's life does not. She still lives in the same house. She still answers the door. She still picks up the phone. And she still does not know when she will see her family again. This is where accountability becomes unavoidable. The media often justifies coverage of vulnerable communities by citing awareness. Awareness of poverty. Awareness of disability. Awareness of systemic neglect. But awareness without responsibility becomes exploitation. It turns real people into symbols and leaves them to absorb the consequences alone. Betty is not a case study. She is not an abstract example. She is a woman who lost her siblings and nephew without understanding why, and then lost her privacy because the world wanted answers she does not have. The state, too, bears responsibility. Removing vulnerable adults from a home may sometimes be necessary, but removal without clear communication is not protection. It is disorientation. Betty's repeated statement that she does not know why her family was taken is not a minor detail. It is evidence of a breakdown in process. If the state determined that Ray, Lorraine, and Timmy could not remain in the home, Betty should have been given a clear explanation in terms she could understand. She should have been assigned an advocate immediately. She should have been told where her family was taken, what conditions would allow visits, and what steps, if any, could lead to reunification or supervised contact. Instead, she was left in the dark. That darkness is not just emotional. It is structural. Without information, Betty cannot advocate for herself. Without guidance, she cannot comply with requirements she does not understand. Without support, she becomes dependent on strangers who promise help without authority. This is how vulnerable people fall through the cracks. And then there is the public, the audience that consumes stories like this and believes concern alone is enough. It is easy to feel sympathy. It is easy to share an article. It is easy to argue in comment sections. It is much harder to recognize when engagement itself causes harm. Every time Betty's face is shared, more people feel entitled to her story. Every time her words are quoted, more strangers feel invited into her life. Every time the story trends, the pressure on her increases. The public often demands transparency from institutions, while forgetting that transparency should never come at the expense of someone's safety. Betty does not owe the world answers. She does not owe clarity. She does not owe closure. She owes nothing. The tragedy of her interview is not that she spoke. It is that she spoke without protection. True accountability now would look different than outrage. It would mean ensuring Betty has a professional advocate who can manage communication with the media. It would mean limiting access to her home. It would mean educating her, slowly and patiently, about what has happened and what options exist. It would mean prioritizing her emotional stability over public curiosity. It would also mean restraint from journalists, from content creators, and from viewers. Not every story needs another article. Not every quote needs another breakdown. Not every tragedy needs another voice added to the noise. Sometimes the most ethical choice is to stop asking questions. Betty said she could not stay silent anymore. That does not mean she asked for the spotlight. It means she reached a breaking point. Silence was never consent. Silence was survival. And now that she has spoken, the responsibility shifts to everyone else. The media must ask whether it is equipped to handle stories involving intellectual disability with care rather than convenience. The state must ask whether its processes truly center the people they affect. The public must ask whether its curiosity helps or harms. Because once a vulnerable person becomes a headline, there is no undo button. The Whittaker story is not over. Betty's story is not resolved. Ray, Lorraine, and Timmy remain out of sight. Betty remains alone, and the answers remain incomplete. But one thing is clear: this is no longer just a family tragedy. It is a test of how society treats people who cannot protect themselves once they are seen. If the world truly heard Betty when she said she couldn't stay silent anymore, the response should not be louder voices. It should be better ones. Trained ones. Responsible ones. Protective ones. Otherwise, silence may have been the safer option all along. Comment below what you think. Thank you for watching this video. Click here to watch another video that might interest you.